This is by New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. He said, America didn't become the richest country in the world by practicing socialism, or the strongest country in the world by denigrating its governing institutions, or the most talent-filled country by soaking fear of immigrants. It got here via the motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one.
This nation is a great and glorious nation that has a history that really deserves to be known. It's done some horrible things, starting with the indigenous people, slavery, the Chinese who built the railroads, the Japanese who, some of whom were housed not too far from here. And yet, it is recognized as the shining example of democracy and opportunity. And it is all those things. Unless we face the reality of who we are, I do not believe that we will get to the best place where we can be.
My first instinct about the election was that we lost our civic faith. We come to being Americans as spiritual people, and we bring our religious faith to the table, we bring our humanity to the table, we bring our partisanship to the table. And what I watched my colleagues and fellow voters do was lose their civic faith in the last election cycle. We didn't explore how deeply we love and abide by who we are as a country and understand that that's an idea. We did not bring process to be celebrated. We in fact averted process at every turn. We shunned actual legitimate process, and instead of having debate, which is actually good, dissent is lovely and deeply American. Instead of having rigorous, meaningful debate, we had attack and defensiveness. And there's a concern for me that we are going to now start wholeheartedly abandoning process and wholeheartedly abandoning a faith, a civic, secular faith in who we are. And if we lose sight of that compass point, I am fearful for what we hand to the next generation. Not the generation here who is about to assume the cusp of leadership, but the generation outside of here who's sitting in an elementary school classroom worried about their colleagues, their neighbors, their friends, their parents.
There's a sense of not belonging together, a lack of cohesiveness, a disjointedness, which has been fermenting for a long time. This election is simply the one thing, event that pushed it into a public way that we can no longer ignore it anymore. This is a conversation that has been long overdue. It has been for a long time being pushed to the sides by policymakers, by good intentions. But poverty, homelessness, mass incarceration, the environment, a sense of social and economic mobility, economic opportunity, the inheritance for future generations. These are not academic issues. These are very existential issues for people on a daily basis. And if there is one thing to be taken away from what people are feeling right now, and let me tell you, if there's this idea that somehow this is an either-or proposition, one side is here and the other side is there, and then there's this big divide, I would beg to differ with that. What you have are a lot of communities that are overlapping in different kinds of interests and a sense of alienation and a sense of loss, which I may have with one person over here and a total one over there. But the one common theme is that a non-responsive government, a sense of alienation, not being heard, and the things that are most near and dear to us that we hold personally, not having a capacity to articulate it to someone who is willing to, in a responsible way, listen to it. So there's a sense of loss here from many different perspectives. But there's also an opportunity here if we listen to each other to say that there has to be a better way. Because what the last political process was, and it doesn't matter which side of the conversation you were on, nobody can in a deep, genuine, honest way say that that political process was the best defining moment of who we are as a nation and what we hold up as an ideal for the world to emulate.
I tell you with no joy that I bet 3 of my friends that still live in Chicago that Trump was going to win. Not because I wanted that to happen, but because there are more people in America who hate and think the cause of their lack or lacks is the fault of people who don't look like them.
Trump didn't start a movement. The movement was there, the sentiment was there, the frustration and anger was there. He just became the expression of that. The parade
I
didn't.
think that's what it's pointing to, yeah.
But I want to maybe say that I think that there's some truth to that. I think there's I often say I think there are 2 types of politicians. There's a thermostat and a thermometer. A thermometer is a tool that will tell you what the temperature is in the room, and a thermostat will change the temperature in the room. And sometimes our job is to be a thermostat, or a thermometer, is to reflect the mood of our constituents. But sometimes our job is to be a thermostat, and is to change the temperature in the room. And I think there are good examples of that as well. So probably a thermometer is the same thing as a parade. But the thermostat, I think of what we did as Utahns, Republicans and Democrats, around non-discrimination and religious liberties. The overwhelming mood of the public was supporting. So we, for those of you who aren't Utahns or maybe, but passed legislation protecting against discrimination in housing and employment for LGBT Utahns, and did it in a way with support from our religious communities. And when that conversation started, the public didn't support that. If we were leaders of a parade or thermometers, that would not have happened. But we had many people. I'm proud to be one of them. I think all of you have been one of them, participating in this conversation, being thermostats. And we changed the temperature in the room today, that we passed legislation with overwhelming public support and legislative support. We've done that in several contexts, and I hope that that's what today's a little bit about, is maybe what is the parade, but also where do we want to set the thermostat?
The hallmark of civility always, I go back to a quote. I'm going to share a quote back in my response. To Stephen L. Carter, a lawyer and law professor out of Yale, who talks about civility as the idea of listening, not with the intention of being right, but with the knowledge that you just might be wrong.
Let me sort of give you a little different nuance on that, because I think you're right. I on a daily basis, see incredible violence. I see incredible, nasty things that are done to human beings by other human beings. But through that pain, I also see some incredible courage. I also see incredible resiliency. I see incredible compassion and generosity. But you're right, and I've said it this way. Here's my hypothesis. And my hypothesis is, when the policymakers fail to address issues of social justice, economic justice, political justice, public health, environmental health, those public policy failures manifest themselves as crises in our community.
I look at this election and I can see that many of us are in a sense of mourning for what our better selves are and what we expect of ourselves in many cases, our conversations we have with neighbors, but most importantly, our elected officials. And I think for too long we've assigned the role of an elected official simply as someone who, I'm in the state legislature, so we have 2 jobs. One is pass the budget and make the laws. And we do a fairly good job at both of those things. But we've got to transcend that role definition and include being a better example, being better mentors, being better examples of civil dialogue, of humanness, of being the type of people that we want to see. We don't see that at many levels of government. And I think part of that is we don't expect that of our leaders.
Everybody uses diversity to cover whatever they're thinking and don't want to say. We need more women in these positions. We need a woman to be head of the Department of Defense. We won't be sending babies to die in the Middle East in the same way. Well, we need that diversity. You know, we need the different races represented. We certainly need our American Indians represented, and our children who have lived here all their lives. You talk about immigrants, except for the American Indians and those they brought over here on slave ships, all y'all immigrants. Okay.
I think that there's constitutional protections for people. You know, you can't, and so I don't think people are going to be forced to get on an airplane and go home. And I certainly wouldn't allow that. You know, I would stand in the way, and I would stand with them, and I would own their fears and make them I would stand with them and work against that. I think that many Republicans and Democrats would stand with me in that regard.
And I think what we've forgotten in our conversation about how to deal with fear is that we are capable of simultaneously holding two things that oppose each other. We are deeply capable people, and we can hold two opposite ideas at the exact same moment. For example, a police officer at the end of the day can return home following his or her shift, and a young person who is troublesome or even troubled and experiencing that out loud and in color in our communities by their actions, by their words, by their very participation in whatever their community is going through, can also simultaneously return home to their families at the end of the day. We no longer, as responsible parties, have to hold one extreme. We now have to start to widen our capacity and hold 2 or 10, as the case may be. And our conversation, our language is so confined to one position or to partisanship as two things that I feel like we need to teach to the next generation and encourage ourselves to live up to the example of simultaneously doing the hard piece of holding opposites, holding extremes, holding multitudes of points of view, and still acting.
I know that as an elected official, one of the things that's always a challenge is to step away from the concept of otherness and saying it's those people, and even the way you frame a conversation can create an us and them or a sense of otherness in communities. That's not helpful. It's not, and the more we can move to talking less about each other and talking more with each other, those are helpful shifts in perspective. I think we get better policies when we do more of that. I know the past couple of years in the Utah State Legislature, we've done a lot with justice reform. And for me, experiences that I was having as we were discussing this as policymakers, that I was having from a church standpoint, where I was in the Salt Lake County Jail, dealing with and having the experience of helping individuals transition from the Salt Lake County Jail into finding a place to live and a job, really informed my perspective on this issue tremendously. And I was able to now have an experience that was very unique amongst my 75 House colleagues and share that with them in a way that was different than their perspective. And that experience that you have and the conversations that you have are incredibly important, and if you don't make that effort, you're not in a position to bring, I think, a breadth and a depth of conversation.
It's not just the mayors and the legislatures and the district attorneys who are assuring that we will stand with them to protect their safety, but it's the PTAs and it's the athletic teams, the sports teams that are inclusive and And we need to tap into what's right with America.
We can talk past each other in an academic sense. We can be descriptively be very smart about the explanations that we're giving. But if you're a coal miner in Pennsylvania, okay, if you're a poor person who cannot seem to get a job after the 15th application that you put in, if you're a person who's struggling to figure out how to make ends meet, or a person who is struggling to find how to pay the electric bill, let alone be able to turn on the TV to get and hear the political dialogue, right? That's a reality that sometimes in an academic exercise we have forgotten. There is a humanity, a citizenship there that is hungry to be seen and to be heard, to be engaged in, to be conversed with, to have you say to them that what you're feeling, what you're suffering, may not fit the academic definition, but is nonetheless existentially very real to you. And as politicians and policy makers, we forgot that part of that conversation.
Unless we confront, and not in an uncivil way, but confront who we are and understand what all of this means, all we're going to do is maintain a surface civility. But let me tell you how you start. Stop ignoring them. Stop averting your eyes when you pass people on the street. A look is worth 10,000 words. I am from the South, and in the South, growing up, you spoke to everybody.
I am going to rage against the loss of my civic faith loudly. I'm going to rage against it silently. I'm going to rage against it with boots on the ground in day-to-day moments. I'm going to find those drops in the bucket. And I am a firm believer that drops in the bucket matter.
Be the change you want to see. Be the leader of a conversation that is elevated beyond what we see on the television, and start to help craft messages that can be reassuring, especially for children.
And the rule of law becomes very important, both as a cultural issue and as a legal issue. And so you have a role to play in that. Because when that initial authority comes in, it is taking the temperature to see if you're willing to acquiesce and abdicate your role of citizenship. And each one of us has a role to play in that. It's like somebody telling a racist joke, right? Somebody tells a racist joke into a crowd, assuming that the people who are the audience is going to go along. But the first person who stops that and says, hang on a second, that's unacceptable, and don't do that around me. That's a body check back to that person that will think twice about telling that racist joke in another crowd. So all of us have a role to play, and we will be tested.
The best thing to do is the right thing. The next best thing to do is the wrong thing. The worst thing to do, though, is nothing. And I believe we are at a time where nothingness and emptiness and excuses and lacking, it can no longer afford to be our perspective. But the width and breadth of who we are has to expand now to the fullest capacity of what this moment in time demands.
Hope is an anchor to our souls.